All right, everyone. It is, we will get started. My name is Crystal Price. I'm the Director of Marketing at the Credit Union, and I want to thank you all for joining us for Clark County Credit Union's presentation of becoming a homeowner. Um, Tonight, a couple housekeeping items before we get into it. Each of you will receive a handout of tonight's presentation tomorrow. So don't worry about having to take notes on all of the slides. You will get all that information and additional information tomorrow, along with our recorded video of, oh, I think I heard somebody and they said they could not hear me. Can you all hear me? Okay. And then I did mention it, but or comments, most of your mics should be disabled. Feel free to pop those into the chat at any time. If you have any questions, you can also use the Q&A feature to. We will answer those at the end of the presentation. Um, we'll have the recording of this available on YouTube, so that will be another way for you that we're gone over today. So with that, we're going to get started. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our host. This is Ryan Lopez. He has 20 years and he joined Clark County Credit Union in 2020. He is our senior mortgage officer and helps members obtain home loans and has been called a mortgage wizard extraordinaire. He believes that home ownership is such a big part of everyone's life, so what he does is makes a major difference in helping members find the best possible financial solutions. When he's not working on mortgage, like playing with his dogs, going to the movies, listening to music, and playing video games in his home arcade. Very fancy, Ryan.
Yeah.
His goal is to retire at 55, and one of his favorite quotes is from Marie de Hus, which says, "The significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them." And with that, Ryan will get started with our webinar.
Hello, everyone, and good evening. I'd like to, welcome everyone, of course, on behalf of Clark County Credit Union to our second annual Becoming a Homeowner webinar. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. Crystal kind of filled it in, but I'm born and raised here. I went to school here, college here. I started doing home loans in 2000, right after college. When I started, there was the manager that ran the department was kind of a mentor to me, and he kind of showed me how to do everything that we do with mortgage loans, everything about FHA and VA and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and all those confusing terms that can be a little bit overwhelming when you're a first-time home buyer. And he really helped me a lot. And with his, kind of guidance, I was able to buy my first home within a year of starting, working in the mortgage department. And he really taught me a lot. And I felt that sometimes the mortgage process can feel really overwhelming, but if you have someone who can kind of guide you along, it can make it feel much easier. And there's some steps we can take to go through all that. So, with that being the case, we can jump into our slide presentation here. So, positioning yourself for home buying, right? And of course, the big question we want to ask is, why do we want to buy a home, right? We need shelter. It's one of our basic, necessities as human beings, that we have to have, shelter, food, water, and everything. The big question becomes, how are we paying for that? Are we renting? Are we buying? And, if you find yourself, out there and you're renting, you're probably realizing that, renting isn't great. Your rents can go up. Your landlord can raise the rent. You could be renting a home for years, and your landlord can come across and say he's decided to sell the home, and now you have to find another home to move into. So being able to position yourself to buy your own home has, tons of benefit. And one of the biggest ones that we're dealing with right now is how home ownership, protects you against inflation. I'm sure we hear about it all the time right now in the news. Inflation's high. If you're not watching the news, you're feeling it when you go to the gas station or where you buy groceries. And if you have, inflation going up and rent going up and other, things like that, if you buy a home, that payment on your home, the mortgage payment stays constant. It'd be the same the principal and interest on that home loan will be the same year one as it would be in year 30 when you're ready to pay it off. The only real difference, of course, would be taxes and insurance. So that's kind of why we want to jump into homeownership. So let's start going on to the next slide here. And these are some of the basic steps to get homeownership. So we'll just kind of, read them down here real fast. You're saving for a down payment and other costs. This is something you'll want to be doing, from the get-go every day, because besides saving for a down payment, you always want to have, a little reserve account or something in case of emergencies. So it's always good to always have a mindset on saving. You have, address credit reports and scores. That's another thing that's kind of a, ever-present constant. We want to make sure your credit scores are good and everything. And I'd say step one is really this get pre-approved. That's the first step in going out to getting a home. You don't want to go out and look for homes. You don't want to meet with an agent just yet. You want to get pre-approved, no matter how early you might think you are in the process. If you think it might be a year, 2 years before you're ready to buy, you're better off to get pre-approved first, because at least then you can get an idea of how much down payment you're going to need instead of just speculating. you know um, there might be down payment assistance programs to help you with that down payment, things you might not know about. So if you spend a lot of extra time saving or trying to address your credit when you might not have to, then that just means that's extra time that you're throwing money at rent. And the sooner we can get you out of paying rent and paying a home loan, the better, right? So once you're pre-approved, you'll choose an agent. Then you can search for the property. You'll choose the property you're wanting. You'll make an offer on that property, see if the seller accepts your offer. If the offer gets accepted, then you're going to move into the pre-closing period. This is kind of the escrow period where we're going to do all the work on reviewing everything and getting you approved. You'll sign all your paperwork at the closing, which is usually done with a title company. And then once the loan funds, you'll get your keys. That's kind of the happy day, because then you can, celebrate that you got your first house. Um, the transfer of ownership takes place before you get your keys, because of course, if you don't have the home yet, there no one's going to give you the keys to move in there, and then you move into your new home. All right, so step one, right? Saving for home ownership. A lot of times, this is the biggest hurdle that people face when they're trying to buy a home. There are a couple different ways to go about it, and it can feel daunting because some people, they still think that you need, a big down payment for certain loans and whatnot. And you'd be surprised. You don't need 20% down all the time. So you'll have to save for your down payment, your closing cost, post-purchase reserve fund. Sometimes some loans want you to have a month or 2 or 4 months of house payments saved after you close. And then any possible repairs, renovations, furniture you might want to buy, improvements in general that you might want to make. And then ways to develop that savings are, of course, try to establish like a regular savings plan. You can get gifts from family members on a lot of loans. You can sell assets. I'm sorry, what was that? Okay, I'll continue. I don't know if that was just an accident, but so addressing credit reports and scores. Credit scores, of course, are an important determinant of how we decide whether you can get the home loan or not, right? Um, FICO score ranges, they go from 300 to 850. The higher, the better, of course. Now, what's tricky here is sometimes you might have like a Credit Karma or like your bank account that provides you what your scores might be. And a lot of times the scores you're seeing on there aren't 100% accurate. So when you meet with us, we'll give it a look and see what your scores are really looking like. We pull all three bureaus, and we go by the middle one. We don't go by the highest or the lowest. We go by whichever one ends up being in the middle. A lot of conventional loans require that you have a 620 FICO to get their loan. That's their minimum for Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. FHA will go all the way down to 580. VA loans are usually about 600, right? And you want to check your scores well in advance of applying. And this is where I kind of say, always kind of have an ever-present eye on your FICO scores, right? You want to make sure, tips for, raising your score, right? But you want to make sure that all your payments are made on time. Because, of course, if they're not, that's going to ding your score. Pay down balances, you usually want the balance on your credit cards to be less than 50% of the limit. You want to keep older revolving accounts open. So if you've had an account for 5 to 10 years, you don't want to close that one. You'll want to close accounts that are newer, right? If you're going to close any, and then limit any credit applications. Anytime an inquiry is done, it dings your score a little bit. There is a difference though, like if you're shopping around for a mortgage loan and you talk to, 3, 4, 5 different lenders, if it's all done within a 30-day window, they call that a redundant inquiry, and it usually all counts as one hit. Some lenders will tell you, like, don't shop around because if you do, it's going to hurt your score. They're usually just trying to keep you from going somewhere else, and they tell you that, right? Check credit reports at least 60 days before applying. In terms of disputing errors, you don't really want to dispute errors. Get together with your loan officer, tell them what's on there, and they can kind of advise you on what might be a good course of addressing that. Sometimes disputing errors on there can actually lead to issues that we didn't have to fix, and it can create delays and whatnot when we work on your loan. And if you have no credit score, we can do sometimes what's called a non-traditional credit score, where we can build a credit profile by looking at other things you've paid for, like rent, for example. We can look at, a year or 2 years worth of rent history, renter's insurance, car insurance, utility payments. To some degrees, they can even look at like subscription accounts and things like that to help build a credit score, right? So now we're looking at how we start to get the mortgage loan, right? Sometimes you'll hear some realtors and some people out there talk about a pre-approval versus a pre-qualification. They're really pre-qualifications don't really exist, right? What you want is a pre-approval because that's how you know you've got a firm commitment to move forward and actually buy a home. When we do a pre-approval, we're looking at your income documentation, your W-2s, your pay stubs. If you're self-employed, we'll assess and review your tax returns. We're going to look at your bank statements. We're going to pull credit report. We're going to do everything, and then we're going to run it through an automated engine where Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or FHA will come back and say we're good with this loan, where the risk is acceptable to us. So there's no one criteria that determines whether you can get a loan or not. It's made up of a bunch of different things. So credit score, of course, is one. Your assets. Do you have down payment? Do you have gift funds? Your employment history. They usually want you to have at least a 2-year employment history. It doesn't always all have to be in the same employer, but they'll usually want you to be in the same line of work. Income and how does that calculate? The way we calculate income is different than sometimes what most people might, especially if you're self-employed or if you're, let's say you have overtime or you're a tip earner. All that can be a little bit different, and what your existing debt looks like when we calculate your debt to income ratio, right? Once you're pre-approved, we'll tell you what the rates look like, but we can't lock in your rate until you actually find a home and then lock you in. So we can go over those kind of things and what the rate's looking like. But once you find a home and you get in the contract, then we can lock it in. So when you find a home and you get in contract and we lock everything in, you'll get what's called a loan estimate. The loan estimate replaced what used to be called the good faith estimate, years ago. And the loan estimate is basically a snapshot of what your loan is going to look like. It's going to show you the payment, the rate, the cost, all those things, right? So then if once you've got all that, you might want to determine what type of loan you want, right? There's all sorts. You've got your conventional loans, your FHA, all those things. And usually this is where the loan officer comes into play, right? The more experienced loan officer you have is going to be able to look at all your criteria, assess your situation, and kind of advise on what might work best for you. Usually what I will do is give you, a couple different estimates so you can see it. Like you might have, an FHA versus a conventional, which one works better for you? Or a VA versus a conventional, and which one works better for you, right? Besides that, you have, different types of loans amongst those, like fixed rate mortgages. Basically means the rate's going to be the same from day one until you close. Payment doesn't change other than taxes and insurance, which if the insurance goes up, then your payment could go up a little bit. If the county raises your taxes, your payment could go up a little bit. But even then, there's options where you can pay whatever that increase might be to keep your payment the same. But the principal and interest of that fixed rate payment never changes. Adjustable rate mortgages, ARMs, of course, these kind of got people into a lot of trouble a few years ago during the housing recession and everything. The interest rate can change. They usually start with a lower kind of introductory rate, and that's usually fixed for 3 or 5 or 7 years. After that period, though, they can change, and they have different caps. They'll have a cap that says the interest rate can go up or down more than a certain amount on the first change, or it can't go up more or down more than a certain amount on subsequent changes. And then there's a lifetime cap that tells you it can never be more than this amount. The trouble with that, of course, is as your payment starts to go up, if your income or something else hasn't kept up with you, you may not be able to afford those payment increases, right? Now, one of the things that's interesting about ARMs is that people think they always increase, but if the market is looking down, if interest rates are dropping, then your interest rate can actually go down and your payment can get lower. So that's kind of interesting, right? Then you have interest only mortgages. These come in both fixed rate and adjustable varieties. Basically means on this type of loan, you're not paying any principal on the monthly payment. You're just paying the interest. We don't see too many of these anymore, but they do exist. They are out there. So if someone mentions an interest only loan, you want to be sure you know what the terms are. How long is it going to be interest only? Usually, like on a 30-year fixed loan, you might see a 10-year interest only, period. And then after that, the loan will fully amortize. So they'll take whatever's left of that original balance and calculate the payment over the remaining 20 years, which of course makes your payment jump up, right? Um, Now, someone just asked a question, if you get a ARM loan, can it later be changed to a fixed? And you can by refinancing it, but you have to be able to refi. And that was the trouble that some people got into during the housing recession, is that their loans started to adjust, but then because maybe the values had gone down or some other changes, like they were furloughed at work or whatever it might be, they could no longer qualify for a new loan, so they couldn't refinance, right? So now we can go to that next slide. All right, so closing cost, right? Um, these are basically the fees you pay to finalize the home purchase. Um, no one works for free, so of course, the lender usually has fees, the appraiser has fees, the title company that's involved has their fees for doing the work they do. There can be surveys involved depending on the property you're purchasing. The county recorder charges a fee to record the change of ownership and the transfer, and there's some mortgage interest you'll pay at the time of closing. So mortgage payment components, right? What makes up your mortgage payment? There's the loan, which is the principal and interest portion of your loan. So the principal is the amount you're paying back towards the loan. The interest, is, of course, is what you're paying in interest. Mortgage interest is calculated per diem. So they just charge you interest every day you have the loan out. And that's why sometimes if you can pay extra on your loan, especially in the early years of your loan, it can make a huge difference in the amount of interest that you get charged over the life of your loan, right? And then you'll likely have escrows, right? Which is your taxes, your insurance. You might have mortgage insurance. The property taxes are just, whatever the county has assessed the property taxes are, right? On when you're looking for homes, a resale home generally has lower taxes than you might find for a new construction home. If you're buying a home new from a builder like KB or Pulte, those taxes are higher than what you might see elsewhere. So it's one thing to keep in mind sometimes when you're out there looking for a home. Homeowner insurance wise, homeowners insurance isn't too bad here. It depends on your home, the age of the home, all sorts of things. You'll get quotes from a bunch of different companies, and you just go whichever company you prefer. You can use, whoever's on your auto insurance is a good place to start for homeowners insurance. If you're currently renting, you might ask your renter's insurance what it would look like for your homeowner's insurance, and you can shop around even once you're in the home. It's not a bad idea to check how much your insurance is charging you every year, because sometimes they start to raise it and you don't realize it because it's built in the payment. So it's good to shop around because it's almost like your cable bill. like, they'll raise that bill, and if you don't call them about it, a lot of times they'll just keep doing it, right? Private mortgage insurance is only required on a conventional loan if you don't put 20% down. On FHA, it's required on every loan. Now, PMI kind of gets a bad rap. A lot of people will say, like, oh, why do I have to pay that? It doesn't really help me. It only benefits the lender because it's basically only there for you in case the loan defaults, right? If the loan goes to foreclosure or something happens, then the mortgage insurance pays the lender some, so it's not a huge loss. The trick is mortgage insurance was created actually, after the depression, and it was made because at that time lenders weren't loaning on banks unless someone had a massive down payment. And I'm talking massive, like 50, 60% down. And of course, that made it so that most people couldn't buy a home. So when they created HUD, one of the things they did was make PMI so that people could get a home with kind of a reasonable down payment and kind of make home purchasing easier for people who didn't have that massive down payment. So all right. So finding a real estate agent, right? Um, there are a lot of realtors. Any lender, we're not going to force you to use any particular lender, realtor. You can use any realtor you like. If you need a referral, we can always refer you to some that have worked with us and know our programs and all those things. But you can also ask family and friends for referrals. Who do they use? If you had a friend buy a house, how were they? How did they like the experience? Some of it is just personality. You might like one realtor over another just because maybe you're from the same hometown or whatever it might be. Sometimes language barrier plays a part there. So all of that can be something that determines who you're going to use. You want to find an agent who's familiar with the area. Some agents do specialize in certain things. Some agents specialize in jumbo luxury homes. Some agents specialize in like first time home buyers. One agent might be really well versed in Summerlin. Another agent might be more familiar with Henderson Green Valley area. So it kind of helps to know because sometimes that can make a big difference when they're making your offer because they'll have an idea of saying like, oh, another home like this just sold for X and the seller paid, Y in closing costs. So, there's those kind of, fun things there, right? Um, Comparison shopping. You can check, some realtors offer a little bit more with the services, some realtors don't. And you want to avoid using the seller's agent. And the big trick is here, sometimes you'll go out, you'll be looking, you'll see a home, it has a sign up front. You'll call the realtor that's listed on that sign, but that realtor already has a fiduciary responsibility to represent the seller of the house. And so it kind of puts him in a conflict of interest when he's representing the buyer and the seller, because of course, as a seller's agent, he's trying to get the seller the best price for the house. And as the buyer's agent, he's trying to get him the lowest price for the house. So it's hard to have a seller's agent represent both. You usually want to, it's kind of like if you were going to court, you wouldn't want the same attorney representing the person you're going to court against, right? So all right. So now we want to consider what is affordable. And this is a big one. People call me all the time and they'll say, Ryan, how much can I be pre-approved for? And I always ask, well, do you have a set idea in mind, a set payment, or do you just want the highest that you can be approved for possible? Because there's two different things. I might be able to approve someone for an $800,000 purchase, but they might not want that payment. So there's a difference between, what I can qualify you for and what you want to pay. And you want to take your lifestyle into consideration when you're doing that, right? So it can be hard to enjoy your house, A, if you can't make the payment, but it can also be hard to enjoy your house if you're what we call, house poor, where everything you're paying is going towards the payment. And maybe now you can't afford to travel. And that's something that is a big part of your life. You like to travel, or maybe you can't afford to go out and eat a lot, and you like to go out and eat, whatever it might be. Um, so you want to create a budget that kind of fits in with your lifestyle to have an idea of how much do you want to go towards your payment. And when you're looking at, the home, you want to calculate all the home cost, right? So think about what the payment's going to be, the property taxes, the homeowner's insurance and the PMI, right? The maintenance on the property. If you were renting before, or if you were living at home with parents or family, maintenance is a new thing. If your air conditioner goes out, you might have to address that, and that could be a big expense. If a water heater breaks, that can be a mess. Little things like that you'll have to consider. A lot of times when you buy a home, you'll get a home warranty that usually covers the first year should anything break down. The seller often will pay that for you. They're not a lot. It's a pretty good idea to have, right? And the other thing you want to factor in is, does the property have any association dues? You know, um, how much is the HOA? Is it just one HOA? Some neighborhoods have two or even three HOAs. So you'll want to factor that all in, and other things like commute time and all sorts of things like that you'll want to consider when selecting the house you want. All right. So now, what kind of features do we want in this new house, right? Do we need a certain number of bedrooms? Do we need a certain number of bathrooms? What about the condition? Do you want something that's immaculate and new, or do you want something that you don't mind coming in and painting it yourself, and maybe putting down new flooring? Maybe you're handy and you want to do some of that. What kind of size do you need? Consider, of course, with size and all of those things, heating and cooling and utility expenses. Type and style of home. Do you want a two-story home? Do you want a one-story home? Do you want a ranch home? Do you want a more modern home? The layout. Do you want? There's properties now that they have like next gen units where you might have your parents living with you. Maybe they're a little bit older now and they're living with you, but next gen properties give them kind of their own separate suite where they have their own like kitchenette and their own private bathroom and entrance and all those things, right? Works good too if you have college age children, all that stuff. Outdoor space. Do you have children? Do you want a yard for them to play in? Do you want a pool? What's the location? All those things. Again, how close is it to work? How close is it to schools? Is it in the school zones that you want to be in? Those are all the things you want to think about when you're buying the house, right? Different types of homes, right? Single family residence is just your regular home, kind of see them around. You have your duplex or your multi-unit buildings, fourplexes, triplexes. Um, these can actually be pretty good if you're facing like a debt to income situation, right? If you're buying a duplex or a triplex or a fourplex, you can use the rents from the other property to help you qualify. So sometimes if debt to income ratio is a concern, this actually isn't a bad, thing to look at. Um, Planned unit development is basically the same thing as a single family residence. That's just fancy lingo for saying that the property has an HOA or the neighborhood has a homeowners association, right? A condominium, we see them all around town. They come in kind of different forms and shapes. Some of them are apartment style. Some of them are kind of townhouse style. I have one that looks like a townhouse. It has a two-car garage and a little yard and everything, but it's actually a condo. A lot of times it's hard to tell the difference between the two unless you actually look at the legal description, which again your loan officer can help you with, or your realtor. The big difference usually between condos and townhomes is condos have some special financing rules that you have to keep in mind when you're trying to get them. Um, on a condo, you don't own the land that the property sits on. Where on a townhome, you do. So it's one of the things to look at. Townhomes, very similar to condos, but they don't have all the special requirements that condos have, And then co-ops. Co-ops are something where everyone in the building, because they're usually buildings, we see these a lot back east, like in New York and whatnot. Everyone owns a share of the building, and to buy a co-op, you usually have to be approved by the rest of the co-op board. They're really unusual out here. I don't think we have any. So you won't have to worry about those, but that's kind of what co-ops are. All right, so the home search, right? This is where it gets exciting because you'll search and search for the perfect home, and you'll look and look and look. And I always laugh because I say, well, once you find it, you're like, this home's great, it's perfect, and then you move in there, and like, now let's change everything. Let's put new flooring down. Let's take down that wall. It's always kind of fun. But your real estate agent will help you look. They have access to the MLS, which is where all the homes get listed that are with a realtor. homes that are for sale by owner aren't on MLS. So sometimes if you try to sell your own home and you list it for sale by owner, you might be like, how come I'm not getting that much inquiry or that much interest from people? It's because no one can see it on the MLS, right? Um, so they can plug everything in there. You can't tell them, I want a 2-story, I want a 4-bedroom, I want X amount of square feet, a 3-car garage, a 2-car garage, a pool, whatever you're looking for. And they plug it into the computer. It's going to bring up all the possible matches, within whatever certain area you told them to look at. And then you go and start, filtering through them, deciding which ones you want, go out and look at them. When you go out and look, take pictures. This is something that people forget sometimes because you might look at 4 or 5 homes in one day when you're out with your realtor, and of course, later that day or the next day, you might be like, which one was it that had that cool living room we liked? Or which one had that really great backyard with that garden? Taking pictures helps because you can remember which one was which, right? You can try to avoid being distracted by things that are easy to change, right? You might walk into a home and be like, this paint is horrid, right? I don't know what kind of fuchsia paint they put on here, but it's horrible. But a coat of paint is easy to fix, especially in between, moving in and when the seller's moved out. You can always, while the house is vacant, you can hire someone to get in there and paint, or you just get a bunch of your friends together and make it a housewarming party. Everyone gets in there and paint the house, right? Um, Visit the home more than once before making an offer, and this is good to consider because you might have things that you wouldn't think about, right? Um, Maybe you've got a neighbor who isn't home during the day because he works at night. But maybe when he comes home, he likes to work on his, Harley in the garage, and he's revving that bike as he's, doing whatever. And you might not like that. You know what I mean? You might not want to hear that noise all night, but you wouldn't have known it if you only went during the day while he was at work, right? School zones is another great one, right? Um, you might go by a house and then maybe there's a school zone 3 houses down. During the day, no big deal, but of course, during pickup and drop off hours, you can have a lot of traffic. You can have a lot of kids walking by. They might be walking through your yard. Those kind of things you got to consider. Airplane routes. You might buy a house and not think about it, and then later discover the airplanes fly right above. Right. Those are the kind of things a lot of times that you'll get some disclosures from your realtor about that. Hey, you're right in a air traffic lane or whatnot, but you might say like, that doesn't sound like a big deal until it's later at night and 3 or 4 planes are flying by every 30 minutes, right? Um, and then this is a big one. Research your homeowners association if it has one. You will be surprised as to some of the odd rules that HOAs can have. My house has one that says, you can't have your garage door open if no one's in the garage. I actually got a notice about it with like a picture of my garage door being open once. And I responded to them. I'm like, I'm in the garage. I'm right there. So I'm like, look at, I had to circle myself on the picture. So there's things like that. Some of them, like I said, in the case of someone who likes to work on their vehicles themselves, sometimes they won't let you have vehicles sitting on a driveway. Or sometimes they, if you have a commercial vehicle, maybe you have a truck or a car that you have your business signage posted on the side of it. For some odd reasons, some of them won't let you park that outside. So things like that to consider. Do you have a boat? Do you have any other toys that maybe you want to store? You want to check all that stuff. Even if maybe you're going to buy a home and you're going to live in it, but you're thinking this isn't going to be my forever home. When I'm ready to buy a bigger home, I'll rent this one out. Well, your HOA might not allow that. So things to keep in mind when you're looking at it. So, all right. So components of making your offer on the house. There's a lot of overall components. A lot of people think of just the purchase price. Um, that's just one, right? Sometimes people will be motivated in terms of how quickly can you close. The average closing is usually about 30 days, but sometimes people need to close sooner. Sometimes you'll run into people who need to close later. So they might want a longer escrow instead of a 30-day escrow. They might want 60 days or so. And for some people that might work out great. From others it might not, because maybe you need to be out of your place by a certain time, right? How long is the offer good for? Usually when you submit an offer, it's good for about 24 hours to get some sort of response from the selling party, right? Concessions and costs the sellers will pay. So there's two separate things here, right? there are costs that the seller will pay, which might be like their cost, right? For example, they a lot of times they pay the transfer tax, or they'll pay the owner's lender policy, things like that. Costs that are traditionally the seller's responsibility. But then there's concessions as to what will the seller pay for you, and those are two separate things, right? The sellers are allowed to contribute X amount towards the closing costs. Depending on the type of loan, they're limited on certain percentages, like FHA allows a 6% contribution, where depending on how much you put down on a conventional loan, it might only be a 3% contribution. And that stuff can go towards closing costs, or HOA dues, interest, things like that. But it can't go towards your down payment. You have to pay your own down payment. So the seller can't contribute towards that. And you also can't get cash back from the seller's contribution. Some people think, I'll get a $10,000, contribution from the seller, and even though my costs are only $6,000, I'll have the extra 4,000 for whatever else after closing. Well, it doesn't work that way, right? If you have excess, we either need to figure out how to spend it, which you can do so by like buying down your interest rate, or maybe paying your taxes a few months out of that, ahead, those kind of things, right? Inclusions are what the seller leaves. This is something else that comes up. Most realtors are aware that this can be an issue, but the seller can't really leave a lot of stuff. The underwriters will consider it what they call inducement to sell, and then it becomes, you have to get the whatever it is appraised or valued. So every now and then you might get someone who has like a pool table, and they'll say, I don't want to move that pool table, it's so heavy, I'll just leave it here for you if you want it. And the buyer's like, great, that's great. I get this pool table. It's like buy a home, get a free pool table, right? Um, but a lot of times, we need certain verbiage to be in the contract that says something like, this is only left for the convenience of the seller because it's too arduous or too heavy to move, those kind of things. Because otherwise it becomes an inducement to sell. Spas are a big one. A lot of time, like an outdoor jacuzzi or a hot tub, those are considered personal property because they're not really affixed or attached to the property. And of course, a lot of times, the seller doesn't want to move it. So there's a lot of that, right? And then contingencies, right, that you want to consider when you're making your offer, right? You usually have like a 10 to 15-day due diligence period. This is kind of critical because during this due diligence period on the contract, this is when you're going to do all your inspections to make sure that you actually want to buy this house, right? Because you might see a house, it might be gorgeous, might have everything you like, and then you find out there's a problem with the foundation, right? And it's going to cost 30,000 to fix. Now you don't want to buy that house so much. Or there's an issue with the roof, and the whole roof has to be repaired. Those things are rare, but they come up. So during that time period, you want to do your home inspection. It's not required for the loan purpose, but it's definitely a good idea to do because you never know what might be amiss in the property. Could there be, mold? Could there be water damage from something that, unless you're a professional, you might not, know. And a home inspection, might cost you like $300, $500, but it can be worth saving you a fortune in headaches and expenses later, right? And in the financing, usually the contract will say, are you doing FHA? Are you doing conventional? That kind of thing. Are you doing VA? And some of that is important because there are certain properties that you can't do all types of loans on, right? Certain condos you can't get an FHA loan on. A condo has to be on FHA or VA's approved condo list. They actually have a list of all the communities they do, and you can look it up. You can pull it up you can Google it and type in the state, the city, zip code, and it'll pop up on there if it's approved, or even if it was approved and now it's expired. Those kind of things, Um, and then appraisal. How long are you going to have for the appraisal? Usually, you have about 14 days for the appraisal, and this is also critical because maybe you make a $400 offer on the house, and when you get it appraised, it only appraises for 380. Well, at this point, then you either have to reconsider, do I still want to buy this? And if I do, will the seller lower his price so I don't have to pay the difference? And if the seller won't lower his price, you can cancel and you'll get your earnest money deposit back during that contingency period. All right. So making the offer, right? Your real estate agent is going to present the offer to the seller. At that point, if the seller accepts it, then you have to give what's called an earnest money deposit. Now, this isn't an additional fee or anything, but basically what this does is let the seller know you're serious about wanting to buy this house and you're not just wasting time. So, it can be anywhere between 1 to 3% of the purchase price. Around here, it depends a lot on the price of the house. Some of them are as little as $1,000. Some of them can be $5,000. I saw one deal where someone really wanted the house and they gave the buyer an $80,000 earnest money deposit. So of course the seller was like, well, they really want to buy it, right? That person's serious. You don't give that directly to the seller. You're actually, once you go into contract, you're going to send that to the title company and it's going to be in their escrow account. The title company is kind of the disinterested third party between the buyer and the seller. And they don't even represent the lender or anything. They're Switzerland, they're neutral, right? So they're basically gonna make sure that at the end everything's accounted for. There's no liens that are remaining from the seller. Title's gonna pass to the new buyer cleanly, so there won't be anything there to worry about. And they have title insurance that they'll give you in case something does pop up, right? But they're also going to make sure that everyone gets what they're supposed to get. So at the end, they'll disperse the funds from the loan to the seller and to the realtors and all that stuff. That's kind of their role there, right? Um, so sometimes you'll make your offer and the seller, accepts it. Sometimes they'll say no, they reject it just on principle. Offer was too low and maybe they feel insulted, whatever that might be, right? Or maybe they changed their mind. They were going to sell it and now they don't want to. But often they'll counter. And that's when they might come out. You might offer 400 and they might come back and say, 410. And that's the negotiation part of it. And it's all negotiable. How soon are we going to close? How long is your due diligence period going to be? How long is your appraisal contingency going to be? And that's all part of the negotiation. Which title company are you going to use? Even that gets negotiated, which is kind of funny, right? Once the offer is accepted, it's a binding contract. And that's kind of when we come back into the picture as the lender. All right, so this is the pre-closing period or the escrow period. This is where, me or any other loan officer you're working for, now we get to work on, getting the loan closed, right? So you'll get your home inspection done. While you're doing that, we're going to prepare all your initial disclosures. We'll email those disclosures out to you, and a lot of it is just kind of mandatory government disclosure. It's stuff to go to sleep by at night if you want to read, but you'll have things in there like Equal Credit Opportunity Act and your Patriot Act and Privacy Act and all these required disclosures. And there's a lot of nomenclature in there. But the most important thing is at that point is when you'll get your first loan estimate. And that's really the important one you want to look at. It's going to have, like I said, the breakdown of your payment, how much you need for closing, a breakdown of all the closing costs, all that stuff. And the most important part about the loan estimate is that a lot of the fees that are on there can't change. So if a lender gives it to you and they say, hey, our origination costs are this, and they lock you in and that's all set, it can't magically change on you at the end. That was something the government changed after the housing recession and that collapse because there was a lot of places that were kind of shady and they were doing what you'd refer to as bait and switch, where they'd say, hey, this is the payment or the rate or whatever you're getting. And at the end, it would be completely different, right? So you'll want to, notify and periodically check in with your lender, right? More than likely, you're going to be hearing from us because you'll get those disclosures, you'll sign them. After you sign those disclosures, we're going to send you the link to pay for the appraisal. You pay for the appraisal up front because the appraisers won't go to the house anymore without doing the appraisal. The reason being is during the housing recession, a lot of them used to get paid at the end. And then when a lot of mortgage companies and whatnot went out of business, a lot of them didn't get paid. So they stopped that practice of getting paid at the end anymore, right? So you'll pay for the appraisal, but that's part of your regular closing costs. So when you pay that, that's that much less money you need to come in with that closing, right? Um, and again, we'll check in with you. Usually the loan processor is going to give you a call. They'll ask you for anything they need updated, like we constantly need new pay stubs. A lot of times the borrowers will ask me, I sent you this. Is that all you need? It's never all we need. it's never. It's, we're going to continually until the loan closes and you get your keys in hand. We're going to keep asking you for new stuff. A lot of times it's updated bank statements. It could be updated pay stubs. It could just be a letter of explanation because maybe the underwriter It's awesome. You know, maybe you gave us an updated bank statement, and all of a sudden the underwriter saw some weird deposit or something odd on there, and she might go like, "What was that? Give me a letter of explanation of what that was." You know, so they're going to ask you for everything. Matter of fact, when you sign and you close, there's even a form that you sign that gets notarized. That's a like compliance agreement that says if there's some sort of issue after closing, you'll work with us to get whatever it is resolved. So, you know, we're always going to be asking for documentation. It's just part of the process of getting a home loan, right? But while we're doing all that and working on your loan, you'll want to shop around for your homeowner's insurance. This is a good time now. You know what property you're buying, you know how much it's going to cost, and you can start shopping around and checking. Check with your car insurance. We might give you a reference like, hey, here's someone we use a lot. They're pretty good. All sorts of stuff. Things not to do during this time period is go out and buy new stuff. Right? Avoid taking on new debt, right? Don't go out and buy a new car, because we see that a lot. People will go out and finance a car for some reason. Another thing we see sometimes, this comes up a lot with first time home buyers, especially young couples and whatnot, is they will go and maybe finance new furniture or a new bedroom set, new appliances or flooring. And sometimes the reason is because they'll see a promotion that's like, oh, you know, finance now and have no payments or no interest for, you know, 3 years or 5 years or until the end of time, whenever it is, right? The problem is you're taking on a 30-year mortgage. So we know at some point you're going to have to make payments on both of these things, and we have to count that against you. So don't do that, because I've had people who literally signed at closing, thought everything was done. They went out and bought a bunch of flooring. The next day, before we fund a loan, we do what's called a credit refresh. And we're not going to pull a new credit, but we update the existing credit report to see if there's been any changes. Have you opened new accounts? Have your balances gone up, and more importantly, have your payments gone up? So you know, those kind of things we're going to be checking, and if some of that has changed, then it can affect your approval. So you got to watch out for that. I had a situation once that I'll always remember. We had a, you know, young buyer. She graduated from school. She had a bunch of student loans, but at the time she had like an income-based repayment plan, and her payments were pretty minimal. You know, she graduated, started working. We pre-approval. We started doing the loan. At the end, we do the credit refresh, and all of a sudden, all her student loan payments had like tripled. And the reason was that she was not working, and the college knew about it, and they reported it, and so all her payments changed. And all of a sudden, at the last minute, we had to scramble to make that work. And it was nothing she did. It was just, you know, what happened, you know, for her. So sometimes that stuff happens. So, you know, think about that. You don't want to normally, you know, change jobs in the middle of the, you know, process, because that can affect you too, depending on the type of income you have, right? Sometimes not a big deal. You know, if you were a manager at, you know, at one company and you had a salary of 60,000, and now maybe you have the opportunity to go to another company and they're going to give you a salary of 100,000, usually that's okay as long as we can document everything, right? But if you were a commission earner and now you're going from one job to another job, we don't necessarily know if the commission you were earning at the previous employer will be the same as this employer. So sometimes that can be a thing. So avoid changing, you know, workplaces or anything like that. Um, if there's going to be two or more owners, you want to decide how to take title of the house, right? A lot of times this isn't too critical. If you're buying by yourself, of course, there's only one option, you know, sole ownership, sole proprietor, that kind of thing, right? If you're buying with a spouse, a significant other, then, you know, there's a couple different options. Most people do joint tenants, you know, they might do, you know, John Doe and Jane Doe, husband and wife as joint tenants, you know. There are a couple of things though that might come into place. For example, maybe you have a blended marriage now, right? You a blended family, you know, household. You have husband who had children from a previous marriage. You have wife who maybe had children from a previous marriage, and now they're buying a home jointly. You may want to consider how title is going to be taken, because if you do joint tenants, then that basically means when someone passes away, automatically the surviving owner has 100% ownership. And, it'd be a cruel thing to do, but in a situation like that, if someone didn't maybe care for their spouse's children, they could be like, sorry, guys, this house is mine now. You got to move out. And they're just kind of SOL, right? In some situations, like you could do tenancy in common, you can actually dictate who has what ownership percentage of the house, and that percentage ownership passes by will. So, a husband could say, when I pass away, I don't want my share passing to my wife. I want it to pass to my children, and there's things like that. The title company is the one who can best advise you on this. And there's a bunch of different ways you can do it. They have a chart and they can show you. And if it's more complicated, you might even want to get like legal advice on that, right? And then the final walkthrough. So we've gone through everything. We've done the appraisal. The underwriter asked you for, 40 million pay stubs, and now you're ready to close. You want to walk through the house before we're closing, right? Because you never know. Maybe while the seller was moving out, they banged the wall with some of their heavy furniture, and there's a hole in the wall. Or perhaps something happened with the pool equipment, and now that's a problem. So things to consider. So you want to do that final walkthrough, right? So now we go to closing. you know, this is the day everything's, all your dreams have come to its end. You're about ready to close. Your mortgage is finalized. The title of the home transfers to you. You'll get before closing, before you go to title, you'll get what's called the closing disclosure. For short, a lot of times we say CD, right? Um, this basically is a final version of that initial loan estimate. So it's going to look pretty much the same when you get it. It's going to have all the things you've done now taken into account. Did you pay for the appraisal? It's going to be reflected on that closing disclosure. Um, did the seller, maybe when you did your inspection, there were some repairs you wanted done? Seller decided that he didn't want to deal with those repairs. He gave you a credit instead towards closing. Well, this is going to take that into consideration now. It's going to show that credit of 3,000 towards your closing costs or whatever you agreed to, right? It's going to have a breakdown of all the fees. It even has a comparison at the end of what the figures were on the initial loan estimate and what they look like now in the closing disclosure. And for the most part, that should be pretty much the same. And that should be the figures you see when you go to title to sign. There might be, a give or take on like your final figure that you need for closing, $300 or $500, maybe because of prorated items like taxes, um, sewer, water, anything the seller might have paid out in advance. The title company will usually break that down, and those are done kind of per diem. So when we do the CD, we might estimate your closing on the 5th, but maybe you couldn't get into closing until the 10th. So they'll adjust for those number of days, right? Um, and then you're going to sign a bunch of documents. It's kind of a mountain of documents. One of the big ones is the note. The note is the one that has the details of your loan, how much of a loan you're taking out, what the term is, what's the interest rate, all that fun stuff, right? The deed of trust is what secures the loan to the property. This is what liens the house, right? And so you'll want to look at that. A lot of times, sometimes they can have some writers. Like if you did an arm loan, you might have an arm writer on your deed. If you have an association, you might have a writer for the association. You'll have another closing disclosure at the closing, and it's going to be pretty much like the one you have, except for any adjustment they might have made for the exact date you're closing on, right? And any affidavits, sometimes you have AKA affidavits that you'll sign. We see this a lot sometimes if someone has a couple different names. Like for me, for example, I always go by Ryan, but my legal name is Octavio Ryan Lopez, right? My dad's Octavio, so I've always gone by Ryan. It was kind of funny when I was a kid because I'd have a friend call the house and my friend would be like, "Hey, can I talk to Octavio?" And my dad would be like, "Big Octavio or little Octavio?" And I'd be like, "Daddy's 6. Who do you think he's calling for? Like, do you have a lot of business with 6-year-olds?" But when I go in to sign a mortgage loan, I've got to sign Ryan Lopez, Octavio Lopez, Octavio Lopez Jr., uh, Octavio Ryan Lopez, like any sort of variation that comes up. If you've been married and you've had maiden names, that can be a big thing. You could have 3 or 4 AKA affidavits. Sometimes you want to go get credit somewhere, and maybe you're at a department store, and they're like, "Hey, you sign up for a credit card, you'll get 15% off." Also, something not to do while you're in the middle of your mortgage transaction, right? But maybe you apply and the person accidentally misspelled your name. you'll see that pop up as an AKA affidavit where you're like, I don't spell my name that way. And they're like, just sign it. and because once it gets reported into the credit bureau system, it's going to pop up like forever now. So, all right, let's go to the next slide. So, tax benefits of homeownership, right? At the beginning, we were like, why do we want to be a homeowner, right? Having a secured payment versus renting and having that security of owning a home is a big one. But here's some of the benefits you have, right? So, tax deductions or reduced taxable income, depending on your tax situation. And this is kind of where you always want to consult with a tax preparer or maybe even TurboTax. They have a question, answering question section. You can always ask them. But you can deduct a lot of your payment. Your interest can be tax deductible. The property taxes you pay can be tax deductible. PMI can be tax deductible. So a lot of that stuff is, this is where it kind of comes into the benefits of being a homeownership. Not only are you now, you know, owning a little bit of your home with every monthly payment you make, but you're also getting this tax deduction at the end of the year, which is going to help with some of your extra income, right? There are limits on how much you can claim on your property taxes and interest and everything when you do your deduction, and sometimes it'll depend on whether you do your standard deduction or your itemized deduction, but there's all sorts of things there. So that's where it kind of helps to talk to your tax guy. Points that you pay on your loan can also be tax deductible, right? On a purchase, there you can usually deduct them in full the year that you bought the house in. If it's a refinance, a lot of times you have to amortize them over the remaining term of the loan and that kind of thing, right? Again, your tax guy is the guy to really go into all those things. Um, and points, just in case we were wondering. Some lenders charge points on all their loans. Though they quote an interest rate, they say it's with X amount of points, 1 point, 2 points, whatever it might be. Some, like, we don't have any points on our loans unless you opt to buy down the rate further. Then you can pay points to buy down the rate. There can be points for a variety of things. If you're purchasing an investment property, a lot of time there's an automatic, 2 points because it's an investment property. Maybe you're doing a cash out loan that can have like a half point. It just depends on what you're doing in your situation. But all that's reviewable, right? And then you might consider, since you're getting these tax benefits, you might consider doing a new W-4, because you might not need to withhold as much taxes now throughout the year as you do at the end, because you're going to have a little extra tax cushion there that can help you out, so you don't have to pay as much. And of course, if you can take the savings, instead of having that tax deduction sitting with the IRS, you can take that tax deduction and invest it somewhere else and actually get a nice little return on that instead. So things to consider. I think there might be
And
another slide.
this last slide here, we did remove a slide, which I'm actually going to ask you a question about. But
Yeah.
at this time, if anyone has a question, feel free to pop it into the chat. If you speak, you can unmute yourself and ask Ryan your question as well. We'll be recording these, and if we do run out of time, we're going to run until 7 o'clock tonight. If we run out of time, um, we will have Ryan's information is here. Feel free to shoot him an email. He'll still get those questions asked for you. I'm going to kick it off. I do have a question that I think maybe a lot of us are probably worried about or concerned with. Um, Rates over the last year have increased. Seems like every other month we're getting a rate increase, rate increase. Has that changed people applying for mortgages, and what do you tell them, and what would you recommend for people wanting to become homeowners?
So this kind of falls in line with the big question I always have, right? People call and say, Ryan, is it a good time to buy a home? And my response generally is, are you renting? Because if you're renting, it's always a good time to buy a home, right? But if you're not renting, maybe you're living at home, maybe you're living with family, you might consider, is it a good time to get in now or is it not? A few years ago during the pandemic, we had interest rates at an all-time low. I think at that time they were quoting, 70 to 80-year lows. They had never seen rates that low. Definitely during my 23-year career doing home loans, I have never seen rates that low before. Even during like 9/11, when the markets were going crazy and we had 3 to 4 rate changes in a given day, Even on that day, the lowest interest rates got to was like 5.125. Um, so one of the big things we had is that, back when rates were low, some people held off. They said, prices are high. I'm going to wait for prices to come down. And of course now prices haven't come down and rates are higher. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch that we're dealing with. I would lean towards buying, because it's always a good time to buy. Because if everything is going up, inflation wise, as we were talking about, there's a good shot your rent's going up. And if your rent's going up, you might as well fix in a payment that you can afford now. That's not going to change. And you'll have that security of owning that home and knowing that you can make that payment and have that payment be the same going forward. And if rates do happen to dip a little bit, right now, I think on our FHA, we're maybe sitting at about, 6.5 to 6.7. Our conventionals are maybe, 7 to 7.5, depending on credit scores and all those things and down payment, right? But if rates dip and they go down to 6 or 5, you can always refinance and bring your payment down. And that would be just kind of a windfall. Some people do hope, they kind of knock on wood and say a prayer that, home prices might go back down to what they were in 2010. Um, I don't really see that happening. It's a possibility, but you have to remember during that time we were going through massive economic upheaval. The housing recession was major. I mean, so major that the government and Congress worked overnight to try to work out a solution to keep things open and running. It was pretty make or break at that point, and they if we experience something like that again, there's probably a good shot that even if house prices were significantly reduced, it would probably be very hard to qualify because you have to
Mm,
consider that if we had such an economic downturn, would that affect your employment? Would that affect lending guidelines? All those things come into play. And we did have that during the housing recession. We had a lot of people say, like, oh, inside of the four sand states, which included us, I think it was Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and New Mexico, they wouldn't lend up to a certain amounts or without certain amounts down. So you have to factor that in that, maybe things could go down, but I'm more of the bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. So if you can get into something now, even if it's not your dream home, is it a townhome, a condo, something, you're in the race. You've bought something that's appreciating, you're building equity, and you got tax deductions. So,
great.
I definitely recommend looking at purchasing, even though rates are a little bit high now.
Thanks, Ryan. And now we're going to jump into the chat. We have a question from Kimberly. She asked, does survivor benefits SSI count as income and workers' comp death benefits payouts while being employed as well? She said, even though being employed, the salary has dropped to a third of what it was the previous year.
So it's a little tricky question. We'll have to see exactly what's that detailing. But traditionally, if you're receiving Social Security income, that does count. But that's usually more of, when we're talking about that, we're usually talking more of retirees or something along those lines. Um, Sometimes you can get like SSI benefits for dependents, special needs dependents, things like that, and we can count that towards qualifying. However, if you have short-term disability, usually that is not allowed to be considered for income because the general rule when it comes to using income for a mortgage loan is that the income has to be stable and believed to continue for at least 3 years. It has to be, reasonably believed that that income will continue for 3 years. And of course, if we have short-term disability, there's no real way of saying. Now, if we have permanent disability and we can get something saying that this is a permanent disability you're going to receive forever, we can count that all the live long day.
Great.
Mhm.
James asks that he is planning to buy a jet ski next month, and he's also looking to buy a house in the next year. How will
Mhm.
that will it make it harder to buy a house in the future?
So, any new debt, of course, is going to make it tricky. So you've got to look at that payment and what that jet ski is looking like. And if you wanted, you could even give me a call, tomorrow after hours, and we can kind of crunch some numbers and be like, this jet ski is a significant portion of your gross take home income. So yes, that's going to affect your qualifying. But on the other hand, too, If your income is, something, enormous, you've got $20,000 a month in income, then a $300 payment might not be that big of an issue. So it's kind of dependent on everyone's individual scenario. And one of the biggest things that I'll mention now, because whether it's a jet ski or a boat, one of the biggest issues we run into with home loans and qualifying that I see over and over again is car payments. Car
Mm.
payments can be significant. Car payments are very high nowadays. I'll see young borrowers, they might be, 22, 24. They're not making a lot, and they'll have a $700 car payment. And I don't know who put them in that. But here's the trick. We know a lot of people, when it comes to lending, all they really know of is car loans. You walk into a dealership will find a way to get you into a car loan. You might have, some ridiculous like 30% interest, but they will find a way to make that happen, without consideration of whether you can actually even afford this or make the payment or do anything like that. On the lending side, especially here at Clark County Credit Union, we don't want to set you up to fail, right? When we do a loan for you, we're not going to put you in a loan that you can't afford. We're not going to look at, more home than you can qualify for. Even if you really, really want it, yeah, we'll be like, I understand you really, really want it, but it's in your best interest not to buy this, a home that's outside of your means. It's something you have to consider with car loans, right? If you're in the market for a new car and a new house, my general rule of thumb is buy the house first, right?
Mm.
Because a mortgage underwriter will tell you no, right? They'll be like, sorry, you don't qualify. You're overextended. A car dealership will find a way. And a lot of times you can go and you can buy a home, have your equity in your home, have appreciation that's growing, have all this, and then turn around and get the car 6 months later, and get it within a reasonable idea. But definitely the biggest hurdle we run into is car loan payments. If you need a new car, get something reasonable, something affordable, something that'll get you from point A to point B. Um, my like I said, I started working out of college in 2000. I bought a home in 2001. By the time I was 28, a few years later, I want to say that was like 4 years later, 5 years later, I had purchased three homes. And all my buddies used to say, like, how'd you manage to purchase three homes? Right. Part of it was I worked in the business, so I kind of knew how to do it. But a big part of it was they all had gone out and bought new cars, and they left home while they were in college and rented apartments and things like that. And I drove an old beat up truck that had no air conditioner, that I was miserable at every red light that I stopped at here in town, right? And but when they asked me, how did you manage to do that? I would point at that old beat up truck and be like, that's how I did it, and that's something to consider when you're trying to buy a house. Sometimes you've got to sacrifice a little.
Great. And Sheila and I believe a couple other attendees tonight joined a little bit late. She asked, what is the credit score requirement to get a home?
So for your conventional loans, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the minimum they allow is 620. On FHA, someone knew the answer here. Samara had it, right? On FHA, they'll go as low as 580. VA usually tends to be about 600, but it kind of depends on the situation. But you have to keep in mind, while 620 is the lowest that Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac may allow, you can have a 620 score and they may still say no, right? So while they allow that, it's not always possible because they look at the big picture. They're going to look at, okay, we've got a score that's a little bit on the lower side. How does our debt to income ratio look? How much are we putting down? Do we have reserves, or do we have a couple of months of payments left over after closing? There's no one thing that qualifies you for a loan. We look at everything.
Got it.
Mm.
And how about, speaking of rates and things, how long after you buy your home can you refinance if the rates go back
So
down?
yeah, yeah. So this also just kind of depends on the type of loan, right? Um, let's say you did a FHA loan, which is kind of popular for first time home buyers, right? You buy an FHA home and then maybe rates go down or the values shoot way up. And now you want to switch to a conventional to remove your mortgage insurance or whatever it might be. Usually, no waiting period there. As long as you're not getting cash out. If you're trying to get cash out of it, then the current rules say you have to wait 12 months, right? But if
Mm,
you're not getting cash out, you're just refinancing your existing balance, you can refinance almost right away. Now, it's different if you're going FHA to FHA. They're going to make you wait approximately 6 months. They want you to have made six payments, is the rule. Even on a streamline, which is like an FHA to FHA, no cash out, very quick and easy process. They're going to make you wait that. VA does the same thing, mostly because some people were abusing VA. A lot of them were doing a VA loan. A lot of like brokers and some other places were doing VA loans and then giving the borrower a very high interest rate with the idea of like, well, use this high interest rate to get you a big credit to offset your closing cost and your VA funding fee and those kind of things. And then we'll refinance you, right away again. And basically what those lenders were trying to do was get paid for two loans in one.
mm,
And so VA kind of came out with some rules to stop that.
got it. All right,
Mhm.
and that was from James. The next question is from Samara. She asks, can you afford more home the more down payment you make, or is it solely based on your income and nothing else?
So this kind of goes back to the big picture question, right? You have to be able to afford the payment. So if, and usually depending on some agencies are a little bit more lenient in debt to income ratio, some are a little stricter. For example, conventional loans, I usually want you to be about, around 45% debt to income ratio, but they do allow you to go to 50, with some terms and some loans, depending on what your big picture is, right? Um, FHA is a little bit more lenient. They'll let you be 50, but sometimes they'll let you go to like 56. Um, However, this goes back to that we don't want to set you up for failure, right? If you are making, $5,000 a month, we're not going to put you in a house that has a $6,000 a month payment, no matter how good your credit score is. You can have an 800 golden credit score, but you have to have what we call ability to repay. Um, During the housing recession, the reason a lot of people got in trouble is that a lot of lenders did what was called stated income loans, where they wouldn't look at your income at all and they
Mm,
would just go by whatever you told them. Well, that shot a lot of people in the foot, and and because of that, we're now all required to show ability to repay. You have to be able to repay the loan. So having a better credit score can get you a better rate, which can mean that you have a reduced payment, which then allows you to qualify for more. It can even open up some opportunities with like mortgage insurance on a conventional loan, which can again make your payment lower, which then allows you to buy a little bit more. But it's all more of a facet of how much payment can you afford.
got it.
Mhm.
And from Miyoshi, she asks, if you get an ARM mortgage, can it be changed to a fixed, and what is the process?
Yeah, yeah, you can do a refinance to change it to a fixed. There is no like conversion. A long time ago, like in the 80s, you used to be able to convert an ARM to like a fixed rate, but no one offers that anymore, at least not currently. Things come around, so you never know, right? Assumable loans that we haven't done in years have kind of become popular again on VA loans because of the rising rates, right? So something like that could happen, but it's really the only real way to do it is to refinance into a fixed rate, which of course would mean having closing costs all over again and those kind of things. So you'd want to consider it, but definitely if you get into an ARM and you know that your payment's going to change, the thing to do is to look into refinancing. The other thing to consider with the ARM is you may want to make extra principal payments. Um, when the ARM adjusts, the loan usually gets re-amortized or recalculated. So your payment gets adjusted to whatever the principal is at that new rate. If you've been making extra principal payments from the beginning on your loan, and sometimes, again, we didn't talk about this earlier, but if you make like one extra payment a year, you can usually cut about 8 years off of your average 30-year loan, 8 to 7 years, depending on the rate. Now that rates are high, it's probably closer to that higher side. So if you have an ARM loan and you're making extra payments, when that loan reamortizes, you have a lower principal, so that change, even though your payment might go up, might not be as bad as if you made the bare minimum monthly payments.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Samara, so she asked about long-term disability qualifying. I believe you said yes. Um, as far as the income goes, she asked, does workers' comp qualify? And I don't remember your response to that or if you covered that.
So again, workers' comp would be a scenario where we'd have to know whether that income is, long-term permanent income, or is this temporary income that we don't expect to continue for 3 years? Um,
Okay.
that's always the litmus test, right? Will this income continue for 3 years? Sometimes we have self-employed borrowers that maybe have a contract of employment with a company, and one of the things we'll look at is how long is this contract for? And sometimes people only have 1 year at a time contracts. Sometimes they have 5 year contracts. But if it's less than 3 years, we can't count it.
Got it. All right. Jessica asks, if you qualify for first home buyers for help with the down payment, are we allowed to add an additional down to help lower the monthly payments?
Yes. Yeah. So if you are eligible for, down payment assistance or any of those grants or anything like that, you can pay extra. It's going to depend on your grants. Some of them do have some weird caveats where, like, you can't have more in assets than X, but we don't see too many of those grants anymore. That's kind of an older thing we used to see. Like if you had more than, 10,000 in assets, sometimes they'd be like, no, we're not going to give you assistance. Right. But nowadays we don't really see any requirements for that. So you can put your own down payment down, put additional down. You might, consider, depending, what you're trying to do or what you're trying to accomplish. Sometimes you might consider maybe putting some of that extra money towards buying down your interest rate, versus doing additional down. Because putting an extra, 5,000 down over 30 years isn't really going to make a significant difference in your monthly payment. But if you use that 5,000 to buy your interest rate down a 1/4%, a 0.5%, 1%, depending on your loan amount, whatever that might be, that could make a bigger difference in your monthly payment. And of course, the lower the interest rate is, if you stay in the loan long term, that's a significant saving over the life of your loan. So,
Thank you.
mm.
From Kimberly, is a life insurance payout acceptable as a down payment?
So this gets a little tricky. A lot of times we can look at the cash value of a life insurance policy, that kind of thing. Um, Now I might type something in the chat there, Kimberly, if I have this wrong, but I'm thinking you're thinking of life insurance as life insurance investment versus being the beneficiary of a life insurance policy. But if it's a beneficiary case where someone passed away and you're receiving this money as a life insurance, yes. So if you're the beneficiary of that, then yes, you can use those funds. It's like an inheritance. If someone passed away and you received X amount in inheritance, you can use those funds towards buying a home. That's considered your funds. It's a version of a gift fund, and the documentation for it is a little bit different than the gift, but it's along the same idea. On the other hand, where I was talking about, if you have a life insurance that policy for yourself that you're investing in, that can sometimes be used for down payment, but it's going to depend if a, do you have the cash value, and how are you accessing that cash value? Um, are you taking a loan against it where that loan is collateralized? Then yes, we can use that. If it's just a loan that's not against like the value of your life insurance, then no, we can't use that. We can't use any unsecured loans for down payment or closing costs on a home. So, you can't go out and get like a personal loan and say like, hey, this is gonna be my down payment. But you could, for example, take out a loan against a vehicle you have that's free and clear, because that's a secured loan. Or if you have a 401k, this is a big one. You can take a loan out against your 401k and use that because that's your own money. Even, a savings account or a CD. You can also sell items you might have, which we kind of talked about earlier. But I had once a young first time home buyer. He was a sneakerhead. He had a massive shoe collection, and he sold like 4 or 5 pairs of shoes for his down payment, and that's how
Nice.
he did it. I had a gentleman sell a family ring, like an antique ring he had from his like great great grandfather, and as long as we can document it, we get it appraised, we get a bill of sale, all those things, a classic car you can sell. Anything that's kind of a tangible asset, you can do that, and if you have that classic car, maybe you don't want to part with it, you can maybe find someone who will give you a loan against it, and that's a secured loan, so you could do something like that.
Wonderful. From John P. He's inquiring about the pre-approval process. He's imagining it that he basically shares his income and his debts, and then the bank or the credit union, I guess, will tell him the price range that he can afford. Can you share with us what the pre-approval process looks like?
Yeah, that's basically it. Usually you'll fill out an application, and you'll provide us, the list of documents we need. The documents are usually pay stubs and W-2s and bank statements. It's a pretty simple list, barring that you're not self-employed or whatnot. It can be a little bit more complicated, or if you have multiple jobs, that's a little bit more complicated scenario too. But we'll look over all that, pull credit. It's a hard pull. So we'll pull your credit, give it a look, see what your liabilities look like, your debts versus your assets versus your income. How much are we looking to put down? And then at that point, we'll say, based on these numbers,
Thanks, Bridget.
you're looking good for X amount.
All right, and from Samara, she's asking, can you use multiple down payment assistance programs, or are you limited to only one?
No, some of them you can layer, some of them you can't. So it depends how they're utilizing their down payment assistance program. Um, for example, some of them will lien the property and they'll say, oh, you have to live in this home for 5 years, but after 5 years, we'll forgive that lien, right? Um, so, maybe, you're putting, 20,000 down and you have what we call combined loan to value that's at a certain range. Well, if you get another loan that's also going to lien the property, another down payment assistance program, then you may not be able to do that because the other one may not allow for itself to be in what we call third position. Or they may not just allow more than one down payment assistance program. But if the program allows it, they will allow it. So
Okay. And Amar, I did mute you. I'm not sure if you had a question, but if you did, go ahead and re-unmute yourself and Ryan will answer that question. Another question from the chat box. What does the first-time buyer program help you with?
I'm sorry, Crystal, could you repeat that?
How much does the first-time buyer program help you with?
Well, it depends on which first-time homebuyer program. There are a couple different ones. One of the ones that we have available right now is called Wish, and they can help you. They do a 4-to-1 match. So basically, what that means is for every dollar you put up, they're going to match four. So if you put up 1,000, they'll give you 4,000, which isn't a ton of help. But if you put up 5,000, they'll give you 20,000, and now we're talking, right? And you don't have to do five. You can do three. You can do four, but there are income limits and there is qualifying criteria. So you'll have to make sure you can qualify for that program. There are other programs out there. They all have different requirements. Some of them, some of them will give you 2%, grant, a 3% grant. But sometimes that comes with a caveat of having a higher interest rate through their program. So it's things like that you have to keep in mind. Not all down payment assistance programs are created the same, and some of them are better than others.
Great. And from Angela, she asked, do you think that she can get a mortgage payment, or any of us can get a mortgage payment between $800 to $900?
How much are you putting down? You know? So anything
Good
is
one.
workable, right? If you say I want to buy a $500,000 house and I want my payment to be $800, I can do that math, but it's usually going to involve a pretty significant down payment. Maybe buying down we can get creative and like buy down the interest rate, but even that you can only go so low. Um, so it's feasible, but it's mathematics. So we have to look at it. One time I had a gentleman and he was saying, I want my payment to be this, and I only want to put down this, and I want to buy a house of this. And I was like, well, if you do this, if you make this kind of down payment, the payment's going to be this. And he was like, no, but I want it to be this. And I was like, well, then you have to put more down. And he's like, well, no, I only want my down payment to be this. And so after kind of trying to explain it, I had to say, sir, the math for what you want to do doesn't exist. So
Hmm. All right, and Sharmini has a question. I'm going to enable your mic. So if you'd like to unmute yourself, you're able to ask your question.
Yeah, sorry, I would have typed this in the chat, but it wouldn't let me. I just had a question in regards to like if I'm a travel nurse, like what does that look like in regards to like having consistent pay stubs?
No,
Or
what they'll usually do in that situation is average, right? So, how long have you been a travel nurse for?
Going on 2 years now, but like I'm toggling because since like I'm getting like ready to like look into buying a house, I'm getting to toggling back to going to staff because I heard like it's better to be staff versus like a travel nurse.
Yeah, I mean, you could either one, right? And because even some nurses have sometimes unusual schedules. Like you might have, call, or you might have shift differential, weekend differential, all those things that kind of come into play. And depending on where you're working, even that stuff can be tricky to calculate, with nurses, firemen, police officers. We see that kind of stuff, right? Usually in those scenarios where the income isn't very black and white and consistent, we're gonna average. So it's kind of a good basis if you're trying to figure out what we might use. So if you, let's say you go to be staff nurse and you're doing your regular 312s or whatever that might be at X amount an hour, we might say, okay, 36 hours a week times X amount times 52 weeks, divide by 12. That's just our gross income that we're going to use, right? But when it comes to your differential pay, if that isn't consistent or regular every week, like if it's changing, then we're just going to average that. We're going to do a separate average of that and add it to whatever your base pay is. The same thing might be for your traveling nursing, right? You might go, you might, fly here and do some nursing or fly there. You might have 3 days on here or whatever it might be. We're just going to look at, how much did you do last year? How much did you do the year prior, average over 2 years, and that'll give us an idea of what that income's looking like.
Great question, Sharmini. And I hope I
Mhm.
said your name right. From the chat, Kimberly asks, how long after some accounts closed that were joint can you look into a mortgage loan?
So, I think I think what you're asking is, if you pay off some accounts, how soon can you look into a mortgage loan? And it kind of depends on the reason that we're paying off the accounts, right? If we're paying off the accounts as a function of debt to income ratio, like you want not to have these payments to help you qualify for more, then you actually don't have to pay those off ahead of time. You can even pay those off, through the loan. So, let's say you're buying a house and you have a, credit card balance that's $2,000 and it has a high payment. And you're like, oh, I'm going to pay that off. I can just mark that. Like, we're going to pay this off at or before closing. And you just show me proof. It's zero balance now. We'll need to know where the funds came from to pay it, of course. But, we could just say, okay, she paid it. And we don't have to count that against you. Now, if you're paying it off for, let's say, credit reasons, like you want your score to go up, well, that's going to kind of depend on when you caught that credit card in its billing cycle. If you paid the account off before they reported to the bureaus, then we might see that update in like a month. It might, they report that you paid it off and then it's going to reflect on your score. So then, a month or so later, when we pull credit, we'll see that updated score. But if you pay it off after their reporting period, it might be 2 months before it reflects. And a good way to track this is where those Credit Karma trackers are handy, is their scores aren't real accurate, but they will show you movement in your score. So if you had a 680 and you pay off an account and like a month later, all of a sudden your score jumps up to 700, it's probably reflecting now. So that would be a good time to go and pull it. But if a month goes by and you're still showing a 680 and you haven't had anything negative or, anything that would, bring your score down, then it's probably not showing yet. So that's the issue. In terms of
Kimberly added
joint,
on to it. She put, what about if it's paid off, then reported one owner deceased and closed?
if it's paid off, then it's paid off. We don't have to worry about it. If there's still a balance on that though, and you're a co-borrower, then we're gonna have to factor that in to what's actually happening here. I have a scenario like this right now where an inheritance scenario where mom passed away and left the home to her three sons. Mom was married and husband had a credit card that I guess he passed away as well, and this credit card never got paid. Nevada's a community property state, so that credit card attached to mom and leaned the property that we have. And now sons are trying to refinance his home, but that lien is attached to the home. So it's going to kind of depend on the scenario and what the situation is with that card and what's going on. And you can always, if you want to call me and give me kind of more details, we can kind of go over it a little bit more in depth. But if it's something that, it ends up you're not responsible for, then we don't have to worry about it.
All right, and it's 7 o'clock. We have two more questions we will answer before we wrap things up. A question from Tina: how much of a down payment percentage can be from a 401k loan?
All of it. It can all
All
be
of it.
from a 401k. Yeah, it
Love
can
it.
all be. So you're only required minimally if you're a first time home buyer to do 3 or 3.5% down. All of that can come from a 401k. It could all come from a gift from family. Anywhere. Those are, as long as we can document that paper trail, we can count it. The only thing to always remember, and we run into this every now and then, is if you get a gift or you have some money, but it's in cash at home, we can't count cash. So deposit those funds if you're thinking about buying a house and let it season for about 3 months.
Got it. All right, and this last one is a great one to end on from John P. He said, I'd like to learn more about all of this, especially how the down payment assistance and which I may qualify for. Is a good step here to schedule an appointment with Clark County Credit Union.
Yeah, yeah, you can schedule an appointment. I'd say, give one of us a call. You can give me a call. You can call the main mortgage number or the main credit union number. They'll patch you through to one of the loan officers, and we can just answer some of your questions right over the phone and do some of that to give you an idea of what we're looking at, what you're available for. Like I said, some of the down payment assistance programs have income limits, so we can even real quick say like, okay, how many people are in your household? You can't make more than Y, and that'll help us narrow down what you could qualify for.
Perfect. Well, we want to thank all of you for joining tonight, and thank you, Ryan, for presenting and answering all of the questions. Each of you will receive a handout of tonight's presentation, along with additional notes and contact information for Ryan if you have any extra questions. James raised his hand last minute. Go ahead and unmute yourself, James, if you want to. Was it like a clapping? Maybe that was a clap for you. Um, Thank you all again. If you have any questions, look out for that email tomorrow. We'll have all of our contact information for Ryan and the staff at Clark County Credit Union. Have a great night, and thanks again for joining us.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks.
Night. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you,
Night,
Michelle.
Michelle.
All right.